You don't have to be a big church with a really influential or famous pastor. All you have to do is take that sermon content, repurpose it, and invariably, if you stick with it, you will reach new people with that sermon content, which is an amazing starting point for getting your church more familiar with the people in your area.
Hey, I'm Andrea Olson. I've been leading worship and training worship leaders for nearly 20 years, and my mission is to support worship leaders just like you in volunteer-supported ministries because I know what it's like. I've been there. It's amazing, but you have a big job, and sometimes you might feel a little bit alone. But I'm here to remind you that you aren't. We'll cover spiritual and leadership growth, practical resources, and get encouragement from other worship leaders from all over the world. I truly want to see you lead from the overflow, not the overwhelm. So grab a cup of tea or coffee and join me. Welcome to the Overflow Worship Podcast. Before we get to today's episode, and I have something great planned for you, you're going to love this interview. But before we get to that, I just wanted to invite you to join our email family. I like to call it family because it's more than just a list of names to me. And I would love for you to join because every month we give away free resources and tools and tips for you as worship leaders in the local church. And this month we're giving away my tips for a successful rehearsal, and also you'll have an opportunity to attend a free masterclass on rehearsals as well. And that goes to our email list first. So if you want to get that plus be on the list for all the future freebies, just head to overflowworship.com/join and you can sign up right there. And I also just wanted to ask a favor of you. Would you please head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a review? I know that you hear that a lot on podcasts and it may seem like it's not necessary, but actually it helps us in the algorithm and all the things, which I don't fully understand, but it really does help us reach more people. But also it helps me because I read them all and I take them all to heart and I use them to help me create relevant content for you. So would you please, just as a gift to me, head on over there and leave a written review on Apple Podcasts. That would be amazing. And now let's get to today's interview. Well, I'm really excited about my conversation today, and I think you are going to love it as well. I'm excited to welcome Brady Shearer to the Overflow Worship Podcast from Pro Church Tools, and you're in for a real big treat today. So Brady, would you just take a second for the people who maybe haven't found you on social media, they don't know what you do, could you give them just a little snapshot into what Pro Church Tools is all about?
Yeah, certainly. So we always say that we exist to help churches navigate the biggest communication shift in 500 years. I got my start as a media director at a church plant in 2010 when I was in Bible college getting my degree in theology and youth ministry. And back then I was very much involved on our worship team. We were doing kind of MD stuff before it was mainstream, at least where we lived in the most northern major city in North America, Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And at that point, I think we all can relate to this story. They saw me with a proficiency in one tech creative adjacent field, and they're like, hey, here's a camera. Why don't you go learn how to make videos? And I was like, cool, that sounds fun. Yes. Don't really have too much experience there. And so I'm just kind of learning on the job. And then I get back to class and I look at my friends and they're all set to become worship pastors themselves or youth pastors or lead pastors in small churches in rural Canada. And I'm like, man, they're going to be the ones that are put in charge of this. And so I just start teaching the skills that I'm learning because I figure if I can learn them with no formal history and formal expertise, so can they. And that was the starting point for ProChurchTools.com. Kind of started as a podcast and a blog and a YouTube channel. And basically since then, we've just been making content and giving away everything that we can in the form of, free teaching material on those platforms.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, and it's such a huge need in the church. And I love that you saw that need from an early stage and you just served the people that were in front of you. And look what God has done with that. That's pretty incredible. So are you still in Canada?
Yes, I am in Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario, Canada.
Oh.
I grew up, my wife and I both grew up kind of near Toronto. And we moved out west to Edmonton, which is kind of up from Montana, and it was just too cold there. That's like real Canada. We most of Canadians live in southern Ontario. We get as close to America as we possibly can, but not in Edmonton. That was real. That was like you got to plug your car in at night or else it won't start. It's where Fahrenheit and Celsius meet on the negatives. It's like, oh, it's -40 today. Celsius or Fahrenheit? That's the same. It's just bad.
Same.
So we couldn't do that anymore. We moved back home, and this is where our team set up. We have 7 or 8 full-time employees here. We got 7 or 8 remote, and then we have another 7 or 8 in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. So we have an American branch as well.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, we live in Minnesota, and so it gets very cold here, but we've had like a really awesome winter. It's been like nice and mild, but usually about every January, my husband and I are like, why are we here? Because it gets very cold. We actually went to Niagara Falls this last fall, took our kids there, and we hadn't been before, so it was pretty fun. Very beautiful.
Well, and just to be clear, Niagara Falls, not so good. The falls are nice. For everyone planning trips in the future, falls are great.
Okay.
Everything around the falls is kind of like, our discounted bad version of Las Vegas. Niagara on the Lake, which is where I live, that's wine country adjacent to the falls. Definitely worth a visit. So if you are making the time, just don't get too sucked into the falls,
Got it. Yeah. Well, hey, now we're going to have to go back because we didn't do that. Yeah. Awesome. That's great. Well, I would love to chat a little bit about just exactly what you were talking about when you were sharing a little bit about Pro Church tools. And that is, you made the comment that the pastor said, hey, you're creative. Here's a camera. Why don't you go learn that? Right. And so I hear that a lot from the worship leaders that I work with through Overflow Worship. And that is just that there's so much on their plate. And there's an assumption that because they're creative, that, oh, you can do the music, you can do the production, you can do the tech and the cameras and kind of figure all of that out. And as you know, it's a vast skill set. And so for the people who don't have the option yet to hand that off to a paid position, what are some of the tools that you've discovered throughout your journey that can maybe help them maximize their time and maybe feel a little more prepared with some tools and some ammo on that journey?
Yeah, what you're describing is what is so true about churches relative to businesses and other organizations, which is we don't have as many resources as those businesses and other organizations typically. Mm-hmm. So what I always recommend is, if that is true, what are the advantages that churches do have that we can lean into to work smarter and not harder and make things easier on ourselves? And we have a massive advantage as churches in the social media department. And when I say massive, I mean truly massive. And that is senior leaders that are putting in a ton of spiritual and creative effort every single week preparing sermons. Those sermons are, in a different word, that's content that we can repurpose for social media. So if you are, let's say, doing worship, and it's so common, you're also like, hey, can you just take care of the social platform? Hey, we need something on Instagram. You might think and feel compelled to create something from scratch. And I would say, hey, pause right there. We can repurpose the content that's already being created in the form of sermons. We just need to kind of follow the best practices. But every church coming out of COVID stepped up their live streaming or recording services game. If you have video recordings of your sermons, you're sitting on a gold mine of content for social media. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's amazing. It's like, how many times can we repurpose this, Sunday morning content and use it, to reach more people? So what would you say to people who might say, hey, you know what? I don't think that we need social media because our people don't respond on it, or they're not on Instagram, or they don't like it, or whatever. How do you approach that? Because I hear that a lot, or I just see it a lot. There's not a lot of activity on their social media because they think it's not necessary.
Yeah, it's kind of sometimes the chicken and the egg thing, right? You presume that your congregation isn't active online because they don't engage with your content. Is that something you're confident in based on conversations, based on what you're hearing from others and believing? Or is it maybe because the content that you're making isn't something that's coming across their feed because it's not engaging them? I also think the definition for social media, sometimes we misunderstand it to be a little bit more narrow than it is. I have a friend, he was the first employee that we ever hired. Day one employee, groomsman at my wedding. Love the guy to death. He will sometimes, and I've beaten it into him enough at this point, or he doesn't anymore. He'll be like, oh, I'm just not on social media. And then I'll look and he's just on YouTube and Reddit nonstop. I'm like, man, you're on social media. He's like, yeah, but I'm not on Facebook and Instagram. I'm like, that's not all that social media is. And what's also really interesting about social media is understanding its history. So I like to break it up into two distinct eras. The first 15 years or so, we call that the social graph era of social media. This is what we typically understand social to be. This is when what we saw in our feeds was primarily influenced by our friend and family connections. A few years ago, TikTok comes around and introduces a brand new way of doing social. Tremendously disruptive in the space. Virtually every platform copies their lead. And this ushers in a new era of social that we call the discovery era, where now the content that we see on our feeds is really influenced by our viewing habits, our personal interests, and really important for churches as local organizations, your geographic location now plays a very big role in distribution. And so what I like to tell churches is there has never been a better time to be doing social ministry, to reach people in your geographic area that are not yet connected to your church. You don't have to spend any money to boost a post. You don't have to be a big church with a really influential or famous pastor. All you have to do is take that sermon content, repurpose it, and invariably, if you stick with it, you will reach new people with that sermon content, which is an amazing starting point for getting your church more familiar with the people in your area. And the reason I kind of frame that as context is because social used to just be about friends and family. But now, in the era of discovery, what we're also using social media for is entertainment. Gen Z is spending 41% of their overall online hours on social media. It's an all-time high. Why? Because the definition for social media is expanding. It's not just what did my friends post today, it's entertainment. Google's VP came out and said that 40% of Gen Z uses TikTok and social for search, not a traditional search engine. So social is friends and family, it's entertainment, it's search, and we also know it's massive in e-commerce. Millennials like ourselves, Gen Z, we use social media and it influences our spending habits. Oftentimes we're buying directly from those platforms. And so what social media is has become this very big thing. So when I hear someone say, our church is just not on social media, my first impulse is, okay, maybe their definition for social media is too narrow. Maybe their definition for social media is one that was true in the previous era, but is no longer true. Or maybe they are really just skeptical that it will work for them. And I'm definitely sympathetic to that. And we can talk about how to approach that. But almost always, when I actually talk with the church one-on-one and we get deeper into that statement, what we uncover is maybe a misunderstanding and that their people are on social. And if their people aren't, the people they want to reach are on social.
Yeah. Well, and that's amazing. I think it gives our listeners some really great clarifying questions to ask, because I think you're right. It really is often there's so much more to it than what we see on the surface. And we kind of just want to throw in the towel and be like, well, they're just not there. It just doesn't work for us, right? And probably more often than not, that's not the case. So what about the point you just raised for those people who say like, no, they're just really not, they're really not on social media. Like how do we approach that?
Yeah, there's the two thoughts that come to mind. The first is what we're seeing right now on social in this new era is a breaking up of generations on each platform. I call this the stratification of social media. It used to be, and if you're, roughly in the same age group of Andrea and I, you remember like a new social platform would come around, you'd be like, oh, well, I guess I'll join it. Because they were so novel and new, and I was in high school when Facebook came out. I moved from MySpace, and then Instagram came out. I was in college, and then TikTok came out. I was like, I'm in my 20s, and you just kind of jumping on new things because it's fun. And now what's started to happen is generations are starting to settle on the social platform that was most popular during their formative years. So boomers are spending most of their time on Facebook. And, Gen X and millennials specifically are on Instagram. And Gen Z is on TikTok. And Gen Alpha is on YouTube because they're not allowed to have social media yet, but they have YouTube. Yeah. And so YouTube Shorts come along, and now that's how they're getting introduced to short form vertical videos. Because they're not allowed on any of the other platforms, but they do have YouTube. And what this means is you might have identical creative options on these platforms. Yeah, you can post a vertical video up to 90 seconds long. But the expression of creativity and the language and the non-verbal cues are different on each platform because each generation is expressing them differently. If this is a little bit abstract, just think about fashion. Think about the cut of jeans that a millennial might wear, or a boomer might wear, or a Gen Z might wear. Well, it's all denim, right? Isn't that the same? No. In fact, these creative choices are actually communicating values about these generations. And this is something that I was talking with a pastor about this weekend. In fact, my OG pastor, he was in town. We do not live near each other. Him and his wife flew out, and they were staying at our house all weekend. And so he is about 38 years old. So a few years older than me. I'm turning 33 this year. And he has a bunch of Gen Z on his team. And he talks about creative choices that he'll make. And he'll say, this to me is a really authentic expression of a value. And then Gen Z will be like, this is the fakest expression of that same value that I've ever seen. And both groups want to express the same value in a way that's authentic, but they're interpreting it differently. I'll make this example really practical. Do you remember, or did you ever use the free stock photo website Unsplash for any graphic that you ever made?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of it. Yeah.
So Unsplash came around like in 2010, and it was cool because they're like, hey, you can just download any stock photo for free. And what was unique about these stock photos was that they didn't look like, Getty Images or iStock, which had that, infamous rather, like glossy corporate feel to them. It was like, that's not real. Unsplash, they looked like film cameras, and it looked like, there was color grading. It was cinematic. That was the millennial term that we would use all the time. So I come across a TikTok the other day, and it's this woman, and she's like, is anyone just tired of Unsplash? It is just the fakest stock photography. We invented a better service. It's stock photography, but it doesn't look like stock. And I was like, wait a minute. That was the exact same thesis of Unsplash. It was stock photography that didn't look like stock. And the whole point of this Gen Z stock photography site was everything was shot on a phone, because that was their genuine expression of a value, which was like, we want to be authentic to ourselves. If we use this Unsplash, like overly graded cinematic, that's not real life, which is so ironic because 10 years ago, that was considered authentic. It was considered genuine, and the glossy corporate looking stock was inauthentic. And so this is my roundabout way of saying that social media is a vast landscape. And if you are not reaching the people that you think you want to reach, or they're not on there, they might be on another platform. And then the other consideration is, if it's 100% true that 10% of your congregation is active on social, which I would venture a guess is true for 3% of churches that are listening to this podcast, watching this podcast. Even then, presumably, you want to reach people in your community that are not in your church.
Yep.
There is no opportunity that is going to present you a better option for reaching those people in your community that will cost you less money, that will require less work on the creative side of things, that will give you that level of reach. And so then you could make the case that we're going to do this for the purpose of reaching people outside of our church, even though right now our existing congregation isn't tremendously active online.
Yeah, absolutely. It's forward thinking, right? It's like, let's look towards our goals for reaching more people in our community and beyond. So I feel like I've heard from people in the past that they kind of view social media as like their bulletin board and like announcements and that kind of thing for their people, right? Like, it's like, we're going to let people know like when this cookout is happening, or this youth event, or, whatever. And what you're saying is let's think beyond that, right? Like, let's think about who do we want to reach, and how can we draw them in by sharing the content that we're sharing on Sunday and drawing them in that way. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, the mindset change is that social media is a ministry. It's not just a platform to promote ministry. And in 2024, if you're using social media overly promotional ways, no one's going to see your content. I just want everyone to think about what their social media feed looks like right now and try to remember what it used to look like. For me, on every platform, when I start swiping now, most of what I see is from people and creators that I don't follow. So often it's folks that I don't recognize. It's the best of the best from other creators that these social algorithms think I am going to like. Back in the day, I recognized everyone that I saw on my feed because it was all my friends and family posting their updates. If all you're doing is promoting, you're never going to get on these feeds anymore. The positive of these discovery era of social is that you can reach people that are not yet connected to you. The other side of that coin is if you're not using social in the way that it is meant to be used, you are going to be, talking to an empty room, going to be hearing crickets. And that's why I get back to that church advantage. Like, you don't need to use it to promote. You have amazing content already in the form of sermons. It's being done for you already. All we need to do is repurpose it for social, and we can see tremendously positive outcomes that come from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and from the worship standpoint, if they're recording the worship as well, because they're live streaming, right? Like, they can share worship moments or, worship thoughts and that kind of thing, and repurpose that on social media as well, which I think is, I always find really encouraging just because I'm, kind of in that realm. So I think we have some great clarifying questions to ask and some great things for worship leaders who are in this position to think about as far as streamlining, simplifying, and that kind of thing, which is great. Are there any practical, let's just go real micro for a second, any practical tools that you would suggest that they use for, like actually executing to make it simple? Because I think working smart is often, I don't know, we might, for those overthinkers out there, right? Like, how can we work smart to get the content out there, brand it, all that?
Yes, let's get practical, because I want to make sure that what we're doing is helpful. And it's not just me waxing poetic and being like, social's awesome, like, try it. And people are like, well, then tell me how. So the first rule, and this is dovetailing off of us talking about promotion, we call it the 1 in 5 rule. And this came from us looking at some of the churches that were excelling the most on social media. And what we found was no more than 20% of their content was promotional. Now, ideally, your content would be 0% promotional. That's how you would maximize reach and engagement. But of course, then that would probably not be as effective as it could be for your church's overall mission and goals. So you want to find that sweet spot. The sweet spot is no more than 1 out of every 5 posts should be promotional in nature. And promotional is a purposely ambiguous term in some ways. You might ask yourself, like, is this promotional? If you're asking, it probably is. So you want a post to be valuable. Let's talk about how to take your sermon and repurpose it for social now. Another practical approach. You can't just take a random part, post it online, and expect it to do well. You have the content, but we have to repurpose it by following best practices. So your biggest challenge is, how am I going to take this 1 to 3 minute section of the message? I believe Instagram just upped their Reels limit to 3 minutes, at least for some users. I don't think I have it just yet. It's been 90 seconds up to this point. How are you going to take a 1 minute, though, let's say, segment of the sermon, and contextualize it for somebody that didn't see the other 20, 30, 40 minutes? That's kind of your biggest job.
Yeah.
And so what we do is we inject hooks into the first 3 seconds of the sermon clip to basically stop the scroll of someone who has never seen this sermon before, never seen this content before. And if you think about the feeds that we just talked about, most of the people you're seeing are unfamiliar to you. If you're a church, if you're a congregation member, a parishioner in a church, and you see your pastor, you're actually likely to stop scrolling because it's a familiar face in a sea of unfamiliar people and creators.
Yeah.
But if you don't know that pastor, you're in the local area, but you've never had any relationship with the church, why are you going to stop? You're going to stop because of the hook. So we inject a hook into the first 3 seconds. And the idea of a hook, when we write it, is to find the intersection of faith and culture. The hook needs to be accessible for someone that knows Jesus. It needs to be just as accessible for someone that has no affinity or background with faith at all. So what we have is an exercise. It's called the 3 C's when writing a hook. And this is where we get really practical. The 3 C's are cliffhanger, common, and care. These are the 3 attributes that a good hook has. And what I'll tell my team to do is, when you're writing hooks, give your hooks a score out of 5 on each of those 3 C's. So on the cliffhanger scale, out of 5. On the common scale, out of 5. On the care scale, out of 5. Add up those 3 scores. We want them to equal 10 or more out of 15 total. That should be a pretty good idea that you got a pretty good hook there. If it's under 10 though, get back to the drawing board. So let me give you an example of a good hook. The number one job of a parent. So you take a segment of a sermon and the pastor's talking about wisdom from scripture and how it applies to parenting children. We will set up that hook as the number one job of being a parent, as an example. So let's go through the 3 C's and give it a quick grade. So curiosity. I'm a parent of 2 children. When I think about the hook, the number one job, it's leaving an open-ended question right there. We're opening a hook in the viewer's mind. It's like, I want to know because you're not answering it. Sometimes with hooks, people will come out and basically say the thesis in the hook. It's like, there's no reason for me to watch. You basically just told me what's about to happen. So that's let's give it a 4 to 5 on the cliffhanger scale. We don't want to think too highly of ourselves here. At least, that's the Canadian mentality. Second thing, common. Is this a universally accessible pain point? Well, not everyone's a parent, but everyone's a child of a parent. So that does affect like everyone. Sometimes our hooks can become too insider centric, and sometimes that's unavoidable. But if you look broadly at the social media content that you're creating, you want as much of it as possible to be applicable to as many people as possible. What we know about scripture is that it is applicable to all people in all times. Hope, purpose, parenting, finances. There's practical, there's existential, it's all in there. So we just got to pull from those parts and frame our sermon clips in that way. And then the final one is care. This is the one people mess up the most. Cliffhanger is straightforward. We understand it. Common is straightforward. We understand it. Care, that one's a bit more trickier. The care quality of the hook is asking the question, if a person scrolls across this, is it something that they care enough about to stop? So I'll use an example. One of our team members once wrote a hook about gratitude. It was a great cliffhanger hook. And we all know that practicing gratitude is something we should all do. Like there's no one that shouldn't practice gratitude. That's not someone that we opt out of. Yeah. But no one, very few people go throughout their day and on the top of the mind, they're like, man, I just got to find a way to practice gratitude more. And so you can't meet people there. You can lead them there over the course of that 1 minute sermon clip, but you can't meet people there because it's not something that they care about from the outset. We all care about like, oh man, am I being a good parent? Oh man, is the budget going to make it? Am I in the right job? Like, is this all there is to life? Those are things that this constant kind of like, internal dialogue. It might be subconscious, but it's there. And so when you see it in a hook, it grabs you. And so practically, that's how you can take that sermon content as it is. All you have to do is write that 3-second hook at the beginning. And now that's reaching people in ways that it never would have before. And the success of a social clip hinges almost entirely on that. One more practical, this is a tool. I think you asked for tools in your question and I gave you exercises. So I don't want to not give you tools. On Instagram, we want to keep the grid looking tidy, right? And when you're working with a sermon clip, you want to create a custom cover, if you can, to gloss it up and keep that feed looking tidy. So the challenge is the still from that sermon clip, which might be like a download of a live stream, which was already compressed, it's probably pretty fuzzy. It's not going to look great. There is a tool called Remini.ai, REMINI.ai. And what you can do is you can take a still from a video, upload it to this, and it will like freshen it up to make it look as if it were a photograph. And so we use that when we're working with churches directly. They, often are sending in live stream footage that's like, 5 out of 10 on the quality scale, which is perfectly acceptable in succeeding and excelling on social. The standard of quality on social is not so high that something like that would be detrimental, but we want to keep the grid looking nice. We'll take a frame, we'll upload it to Remini, and then we have this perfect, crisp, glossy, nice looking still that we can use for the cover.
That's amazing. I've not heard of that before. That's awesome. So I love having this conversation with you today because it's not the norm for topics, but it's something that we actually get asked about a fair bit because it's set on their plate. And so I think we've got some really amazing practical tools for our listeners to walk away with and say, hey, okay, I have social media on my plate. So now I have some really great tools, some great exercises, and also some great clarifying questions to help make sure that we're, meeting our people where they actually are and not just assuming that they're not there to begin with. So we're about to wrap up, but I would love if you would tell everybody where they can find you, the socials, your podcast, those kinds of things. If they want to connect with you, how can they do that?
Sure. So we've been doing a podcast for about a decade, the Pro Church Tools Show. You can find it on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Just search my name or the Pro Church Tools Show. It's every Wednesday, and we basically do deep dives into the same content that we've been covering here. And then my name, @BradyShearer, on any social platform that you do enjoy. Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. We have a dedicated channel that's separate from the podcast channel. Facebook, Twitter, Threads. We're all there, so...
All of it. Amazing. Sounds good. Well, thank you so much for taking time to share with our people today. I really appreciate it. And I just wish you all the best in all that you're doing to invest in the local church.
It was very kind of you to invite me, Andrea. I had a great time. Thank you.
Thank you. Wasn't that an amazing conversation with Brady Shearer? I loved kind of jumping outside of the realm of what we normally talk about and chatting about social media, because I don't know about you, and maybe, if this was not relevant for you, that's okay. But I hear from a lot of people that as the worship leader, they're also responsible for the social media. And so, you know what? Even if you aren't, maybe you can share this with the person who is, because there was a lot of gold in there. So thank you so much for joining me today on the Overflow Worship Podcast. And once again, if you enjoyed today's episode, would you hit subscribe so you don't miss another one? And also, would you tell us what you love about the podcast and tell us what you want to hear on future podcasts by heading over to the Apple Podcast platform and leaving us a review? It really helps us reach more people. So thank you in advance for doing that. And I just want to say thanks for joining me on this podcast journey and for listening to today's episode. And until next time, keep on thriving.